Phenomenology, in general, looks at first-person lived experience. The study of phenomenology is not the study of individuals, though. Rather, it's how particular phenomenon manifest and appear in the life world. The life world is the world as it is lived and as it is experienced. The unit of analysis in phenomenology is not the individual, then, it's the actual phenomenon. In this presentation, we're going to look at post-structural elements of modern-day phenomenological research. Intentionality is a very important key concept to all forms of phenomenology. The term intentionality is central to understanding phenomenology at its core. Intentionality should not really be interpreted as meaning to intend something. Instead, in phenomenology, it should be interpreted as meaning interconnectedness of something. It should be thought of as the web that connects humans to their surroundings in very meaningful ways, whether we are conscious of it or not. Sartre described intentionality as the ways in which we burst forth into the world. In essence, phenomenology studies phenomenon and the intentional relationships that appear and manifest in the life world. In post-structural phenomenological inquiry, the intentionalities are multiple, partial, and always in constant flux. There's no stable intentionality, as transcendental phenomenology might suggest. Intentionalities are still considered ways of being that run through human relationships with each other and the world, but they're not viewed as stagnant things. They're constantly moving, constantly changing. Whereas in transcendental phenomenology, they focus on finding the core essence or interpretation of a particular phenomenon. In post-structural phenomenology, we move away from the core or centralized essence that embraces and instead embraces the flexible, content-related, malleable interpretations of phenomenon, constantly moving and shifting. Meanings are never finalized, but always evolving. For a post-structural phenomenologist, any description or interpretation would be fleeting, unstable, temporary, and meanings are just glimpses of possibilities. Intentional meanings are always in the process of becoming. Post-structural phenomenologists embrace philosophies from Deleuze and Guattari, particularly the lines of flight that designate a moment when change happens, when the threshold between two manifestations or even two paradigms is crossed. As these lines of flight break through the cracks of the old system, new open spaces are revealed. In post-structural phenomenology, we follow these lines of flight as they manifest in order to arrive at the unknown. Sometimes these lines of flight may be radical, and other times they may be very subtle. However they may appear, the key is to immerse ourselves within them in an open, unbiased manner and resist the urge to be pulled back into the rigidity of dualistic thinking. Still, the question remains, how do we approach post-phenomenological research? Vagle, Ide, and Dalberg have written numerous writings on this topic and lay out some clear recommendations of action, and here I'll provide a brief overview. The first step is to identify a phenomenon. Now, it's important to identify a phenomenon in its very multiple, partial, and varied contexts. And in order to identify this phenomenon, you have to keep yourself very open to the phenomenon, outside of dualistic thinking. Step 2, it's important to devise a clear plan for how you're going to gather your information. You need to find those who have experienced the phenomenon of interest. You might want to use common qualitative data gathering techniques such as interviews, observations, writings, which you can use to describe and to interpret the phenomenon. However, in addition, in post-structural phenomenology, we can draw on innumerable ways to gather data. There are no rules, really. So in this type of study, you're not studying the participants, but you're actually studying the experience. So you're studying the lines of interconnections that manifest through the phenomenon. Therefore, post-structural phenomenology permits us to bring forth any data useful in understanding these intentional relationships. We can use quantitative data, we could use fiction writing, we could use role plays, reenactments, arts-based data. Essentially, you can feel free to use any data that kind of tend to belong to other research approaches within this post-structural phenomenological approach. Next, number 3, is we have to bridle ourselves. Now, Dalberg has written extensively on bridling yourself. And this, you need to bridle yourself when you're gathering and analyzing your data. In hermeneutic and transcendental phenomenology, the inquirer is asked to bracket, not bridle, but bracket off her previous understandings, judgments, and presuppositions in order to be able to see clearly and describe or interpret the phenomenon at hand. However, bracketing can be seen by post-phenomenologists as a very lofty, if not impossible, task. Therefore, Dalberg came up with a more feasible option of just bridling yourself. Bridling is used in the metaphorical sense of bridling a horse. So with a horse, you would put the headgear on, you would attach the reins, and then you would use this device to restrain or control the animal. In a sense, you or the inquirer is also bridling his or her own assumptions in order to be truly open to the phenomenon at hand. When bridling, to try to understand our own frames of reference, we can do this by paying very close attention, as Vagle suggests, by looking at the moments when we or the research participants instinctively connect or disconnect with what we observe. These can start to show these lines of flight or interconnected lines. Another way is to look at our own assumptions and our participants' assumptions of normality. What do we consider normal? Also, observing moments when we or they are shocked or taken out of our comfort zone. All these are important moments to document in phenomenological research. That brings us to number 4, write reflexively in your journal. In post-phenomenological research, you are as much a participant in the research as the research participants, and your own reflexive journal writing is very important. So to constantly write in the journal, especially after each data gathering event, and always think of yourself as journaling as a data source. Always think of your own journal as a data source. And that brings us to number 5. Finally, after we've done all that, we want to identify the tentative manifestations. We have to remember the manifestations of phenomenon will be multiple, partial, and varied in the context. Once we've identified these, we can begin to start writing our text, start crafting our text. And the last kind of fun piece of post-structural phenomenological research is that you're allowed to play with form and structure in innovative ways when you're crafting this sort of text. As long as it reads coherently, identifies the manifestations of phenomenon in some way, draws on philosophical conversations, and is situated in a scholarly conversation of your field, then you can be very innovative with form in how you represent this information. And that brings us to our references, our sources.